Welcome to another edition of A Revolution in Education. I'm your humble host, Jim McHugh. I'm here with James Harris, who you've met earlier, but to remind those that have experienced James's background and his passions, and those that are new to the conversation, he is the Business Development Director at 510 Media and the former president of the Oakland Unified School District Board of Education. And we're also joined by Dirk Tillotson. With over 30 years in the education space, I really want to highlight some of his more recent work. He runs an organization that focuses on developing really great schools that are more equitable and more accessible for all students. And he has experience throughout California, New Orleans, and New York City. Welcome both.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I had the privilege of working with James, as discussed on our prior podcast in 2016, directly in Oakland, and now reconnecting with him. We talk about education reform, and we focus oftentimes on Oakland, California. And so I am one to have only spent maybe 7 weeks living and breathing and really being in the community there, but through the lens of James's humble welcoming. I'm hoping maybe this first question, you just talk about, go back and forth, your history of life in Oakland and education and anywhere else you'd like to take it.
Sure. So I came to Oakland in 1992. I was going to law school in Berkeley, and I got a little brother, a CASA, court-appointed special advocate, a kid in foster care, who lived in the Lower Bottoms, West Oakland. And I started to go to school with him at a certain point, as he was telling me about his kind of experiences. And we really struggled with his school. He was a kid who had gone through a lot. He's in his 30s now and still kind of made it out, but still going through some stuff. And at that point, the school was not supportive of him. The school would humiliate him at times. One particular time, I'd be like, I'll help you with your homework anytime you want. I can't always be available. Ask your mom if your mom can't help you and I can't help you. You just got to tell your teacher that. And that's what he told her. And then his teacher was like, oh, blah, blah's mom doesn't know how to do long division in class. And that humiliated him. And then he came, he crying, he called me. And then I I reached out to the school. I'm like, I write this letter about like, hey, it's not really his fault, And then that next day he's like, oh, I better not say anything to Larry because Larry's brother is going to come and get me or do something to me. So I write another letter to them and they bring me in. There's like 5 people in this room, all around a table. And they're like, those were some very big words in that letter you wrote. And I was like, yeah, you learn very big words when you're in law school at Berkeley. And then everything changed. After that, it was like, you want reports on Larry, you want this from Larry. Like when they thought I was a genetic brother, they treated me like trash. When they understood I was a law student, they treated me completely different. And at that point, I was like, this school will not serve you. And then there was randomly read an article in the paper about West Oakland Community School, Afrocentric school, kind of coming out of the Ebonics movement, Greg Hodge, Jamoke, Mateo Payne, a bunch of folks from the community just starting a school focused on Black kids that was in his neighborhood. And I was like, let me just call these people and just see what they're doing. They asked me to join the board. I joined the board. I became very active with that. And that kind of just started me and just trying to think about, how do we have schools that actually respond to the students that are going to them, and actually serve those kids? And we need to, in many cases, I think, build our own schools to do that. Like the system is a long history of not serving us. Why would it suddenly change on a dime? And if it doesn't, how do we make it change? But if we can't make it change, then we need to figure out how to kind of do our own or build our own spaces. And that was kind of my start on really thinking about schools and school reform, outside of just being a kid going to school and understanding the different opportunities that school affords kids, and the challenges, again, of school, particularly when you're Black. Even in the good schools, a lot of the time you're treated good schools. You're a second-class citizen there, where you're fighting for your kind of cultural existence within those, even if you're getting academic skills. And then you have the other option. We have schools where you don't even have a 7th or 8th grade math teacher, but it may be more culturally affirming in some ways because it's within the community. And that's kind of the choice we often have. Have an under-resourced school that probably won't prepare you in the neighborhood, or have a relatively over-resourced school that might kind of destroy your soul by your attending it.
I have a couple notes that I took down based on your introduction there, Dirk, and I really appreciate it. But I want to offer the floor to James to respond to any of what you just discussed.
No, dude. I mean, I think that's I agree completely with what Dirk outlined. I think that's why we vibe so tough, because we never forgot like where it all started and why we engage. Like, and so my story. I grew up in Oakland. I grew up in North Oakland at my grandmother's house. And when my dad got enough money to buy a house, he moved to East Oakland, literally right across the street from Burkhalter. And I went to elementary school at Cleveland Elementary. But in the Black community, when I was a kid, there was this conversation that started, and that was like 1983, 4, 5 kind of thing. And it was like, public school is that's not going to work for your kid, right? You got to find a different way. And so that conversation was already bubbling up in Black communities, and Black families in the 80s were like, this system's not serving our kids. How do we find different resources? So you saw a lot of programs like A Better Chance pop up, and which were trying to give Black people entry into school opportunities, private school opportunities, even boarding school opportunities. And so that's kind of how I came up. But I always, I was from the town. All my friends were from the town. And what I started to notice was, man, I had an opportunity to go to Wilmerding High School. I had an opportunity to go to a school literally right next door to Castlemont High School called Hope Academy. That's where I graduated 8th grade. And I started to see the discrepancy. I'm like, damn, I'm getting this and they're not. And so I kind of grew up in these two worlds, like seeing the public space, but experiencing this private school space where teachers were taking time, where there's, like Dirk was saying, where there's still judgment. Like, it's not like I went to Lick and it was like, it's all good. It was like, my dynamic was like, young white girl saying, can I touch your hair? Like, so it's this whole other kind of experience that you get that I was swept up into. And so, I kind of, that it didn't scar me, but it marked my memory. And and I really credit the first opportunity I had to actually engage as a teacher to working at AIM High, which is a summer program that started in San Francisco, designed to impact really Black and brown and poor Asians, like poor Blacks, poor brown, poor Asian kids, and give them access to opportunities. And so I graduated from that program and then went on to become a teacher's assistant. And I really was like, man, I really dig the connection that I'm able to develop with kids, and always just wanted to hold them accountable. Like, always felt like that, if they saw things, then they could do anything. And that really became a hallmark for how I taught, and later went on to become a teacher, and how I tried to show up on the school board in a way of like, let's set an example for these students. But, kind of what Dirk was alluding to is like, we're now so wrapped up into like our arguments that we forget the real genuine part of like why we showed up to education in the first place, or like, how important either a teacher was to us or students are to who we are. So that's my quick reflection on that.
No, I appreciate that. And again, the common theme between both of your stories is this notion of, well, what systems are in place? And we oftentimes hear, especially now during this pandemic, is the system is broken. But there's pushback to that, understandably so, because the system is working entirely how it was developed. And so we need to think about the reform, the change, the dismantling of certain systems that are truly oppressive to Black and brown students, and think about doing it in a way that's artful, that's inclusive, and that's mindful that a lot of students have trauma. And sometimes it's not something as severe as some of the news stories that you might see coming across your social media. It could be experiences that you've had, James, where you mentioned another student that isn't exposed to a student of a different culture or perspective or identity and asking, can I touch your hair? I mean, that is a beautiful moment, but it is also something that is exposure, and exposure is learning, essentially. And Dirk, I'm mindful of one of the posts that you listed on your website in terms of the color of law and this integration of housing, health, and schools. But I also think about transportation, and I think about so many other public services. And I'm also mindful that Oakland is a very progressive place. So I'm wondering, maybe this is where we turn the topic of our discussion next, is what is this integration of all these different public spheres? How do you see reform playing into that? And what are you demanding? What is the message that you're sending when you're knocking on that door?
So I'd say there's some bigger picture pieces that I'd say what that actual demand isn't formed completely. And then there's smaller pieces where I think we do have demand formed. Oakland is a progressive city in a lot of ways. It's not in terms of how the outcomes for Black and brown kids are. It's not. We're not seeing progress there. We're seeing Black kids are doing worse compared to white kids in terms of reading and math than they were 4 years ago. And the city, again, the color of law, I do think it's really important to go back to history on this and why we're in the place we are. Like, let's just talk about BART for a second. BART's getting about $1.3 billion in federal money from the various kind of relief acts that have come out. When BART came through, it destroyed Black houses. It bisected the Black community. It created a byway from the suburbs to the cities. It subsidized travel for white folks. How many Black folks were hired in skilled jobs on BART? Even though there was a federal requirement of affirmative action, zero, not a single one. When the post office in West Oakland came in, 300 mostly Black families were moved out. How many Black folks were hired in skilled labor? Not a single one. Again, so and who benefits from the post office? It's not West Oakland primarily, it's the whole area that benefits. So we have these communities, by virtue of the law, have gotten the byproducts. 38 hazmat sites within a couple miles of McClymonds High School as a result of redlining and zoning. Funny air, funny tasting water, asthma rates. All those things are a byproduct of government policy in West Oakland. And like, what is owed to fix that? So I think that's the big picture. That's what's really owed. And there are ways we could do that. Invest in broadband infrastructure deep in West Oakland. There are ways we can just invest in the infrastructure that historically has been underinvested in. Housing infrastructure, mental health infrastructure, school infrastructure. Mac is the only high school that hasn't had a full redoing, from what I understand, out of the comprehensive high schools. And it's the one Black high school left in Oakland. So there are ways. I think government is about distributing resources and opportunities ultimately. That is what it does. There are ways we could consciously just redistribute some of those. And I do think big picture reparation stuff, we should think about how that actually comes into play. Small picture, I just think there's things we can do very practically on the school side. Again, you could just give more money to the lowest performing subgroups. We know who those are. If those change over time, then hallelujah. I'll be blessed when Black kids are not the lowest performing subgroup in Oakland. I'll feel like we actually did something. We can hire more Black and brown teachers and make sure they're supported and developed and don't leave the profession. There's a ton of research around the effects that those teachers have on all kids. All kids prefer Black and brown teachers over white teachers. And there's a ton of research around the actual research outcomes for those kids when you got to see someone like you to be that in some ways and to have those aspirations. And if you want to get equality and gifted and talented, have more Black teachers. You want to get better around suspension and expulsions. A Black kid with an IEP who's low income is 30 times more likely to be suspended than a non-Black kid without one. 30 times. We had 130 Black kids suspended in kindergarten or something like that last year. Like that's madness.
Yeah.
And so there are things we can do around those, but I think we got to think of redistribution ultimately, and it's not just a bunch of talk. Go ahead, James.
No, man, I was going, because what you're saying is, I think oftentimes we look at this and we say, oh, well, that's welfare, that's reparations. But wait a minute, the GI Bill, you just look at the GI Bill, it was a subsidy program that was designed to, first of all, place all American eyes on the idea of buying homes, place all American eyes on the idea of entering the technocracy. So it was a giant subsidy program that funds things like where I'm sitting, Sheffield Village, Alameda, like, so all of these things were done. Like, there were even back to New Jersey, all over the country, the government said, here's a loan to get you started. You can go to college, you can buy a house, but guess who can't get that loan, right? And so the exclusion of people on the front end of this thing, and you say, okay, the GI Bill starts in 1944, but then you say, you know what? But if you're Black, you can't get this thing. And then they literally hold you, and then they say, oh, you know what? And 20 years later, you can get this thing. And then do you know the devastating effects that has on when somebody buys a home in a community? Those communities start to form. They start to develop cultures. They start to develop habits. Who's allowed, who's not allowed. And then, so, Joe Morgan, Bill Russell, all the people that went to McClymonds, they didn't really have a choice, right? So it's like they went to Mac. Ricky Henderson went to Tech because he couldn't go to Skyline, right? So it's like, Black community was created out of necessity. And so what happens then when you lift those things, so we got to look at the dynamic effect that our own history has had on us. So when Dirk talks about there being solutions, the solutions are those things that increase community productivity, right? So when you invest in broadband, when you invest in schools, in things that make people active in community, guess what you're doing? You're actually improving community. But when you don't do those things and you pretend that you can't, which is the problem, is what perpetuates this deal. Because it's like, I'm happy that there's stimulus checks going out. I'm not happy that everybody's making $160,000 a year is getting them. But so you're telling me you can do this again and again with stimulus, but when it comes to let's figure out education, you can't write a $2 trillion check. I mean, so we talk about it in a way that's ridiculous. We know the solution. We created a solution 80 years ago, but it's like, well, we don't know how to solve this problem. And so I think it's kind of absurd. But I just wanted to kind of, highlight that point Dirk is making. There are solutions in our tool belt, but we won't use them to impact the families that need it more.
And that's the system. Again, as you said, Jim, before, it's like the system, we have such a diverse country. It's amazing how consistent results for Black kids are across the entire country. It's really about 20% of Black kids can read. Anytime it's 18% in Oakland, 18 and a half. Whenever I throw that out, people in like Fairfax is be like, we're 17 and a half. People all over the country will kind of hit me up and be like, yeah, it's just about the same here. New York Times had this graphic where they had all the urban districts across the country and they just compared test scores. You couldn't find a single one where Black kids were equal to or better than white kids. Not a single district. In such a diverse country, just by the random chance of 1 in a million strike of lightning, you'd think that would happen by randomness. It's such an exquisitely designed system that so consistently brings the same exact results, no matter where you are. It's deep. It really is. And part of it is our just denial that that's really what's happening. Like, again, I just think we have the state of Black education stuff. I think when you look at the numbers, I think for any well-meaning person, you can never say, you'll be like, never back to normal, where 18.5% of Black kids read and 72% of white kids read, like 11.5% of Black kids can do math on grade level and 63% of white kids do. Like, those numbers are ridiculous. 30 times more likely is for a Black kid to be suspended with an IP. Is that a system that anyone can defend?
I would argue no, but I think there are many that say it's working and it's fine, and then they'll give you the the small sample size of certain demographics or certain communities that represent Black and brown students and say, hey, it's working here. So obviously there are points in which it works. And back to your point, James, is like, I don't know if we align what we're talking about with the manifestation of our actual actions. So my example would be during the last 4 years before Biden's administration, we spent so much. The national debt was its largest in comparison to previous administrations. But the talking point was that we need to still cut taxes because that's what's going to help the economy. And there's such a disconnect between those two things. And I know that's a simple analogy, but when we talk about the generational impact, we go back to the GI Bill meant for white people. We go back to housing and the discrimination there when you could start and really build capital by having land and a property that was built for white people. And so generationally speaking, when you tap in and you're consuming news and trying to educate yourself now, it becomes a thing of, are you actually attending to the root cause of the problem, or are you seeing the manifestation of effects that have bred out because of these oppressive policies and systems in place? So I suppose, and I want to honor Chris's contribution to this dialogue, which again, for viewers and listeners at home, Chris Unger is the other host of this podcast. He wanted to press both of you and say, okay, if not system-wide, how would you tap into those conversations that elicit maybe inclusiveness around those that have been oppressive, because trauma runs both ways, or knocking against them to truly revolutionize and build coalition? Or for him, what school would you design to ensure that the communities that you mentioned, Dirk, demonstrate an equality of outcomes for all students, white, Black, brown, you name it. So take any of those questions as you'd like.
All right, I'll jump because I know Dirk is gonna fire it off. So I'll get it started. But as there was a James Brown movie where James Brown is trying to convince his agent to leave the agency and come work for him, and he said, "Hey man, you see where this thing is headed." And then next scene, the agent's working for James Brown. But education, we can see where this is headed, and continuing to do things this way is not going to work. It doesn't work. And the pandemic has opened this thing up so we can see clearly. It's like, man, this is bad. I just did a piece on college debt, and we got everybody betting big that college is the way, So much so that we have almost $2 trillion of debt on the books in college debt, where kids are chasing this dream and running up debt to do it. So in 20 years, 2 kids, $1 million to go to Pepperdine. I mean, we can see that this system, we can see the outcomes of Black and brown students going down. So what do we need? What do we need? Alternative experiences that aren't confined to a 4-wall classroom where students sit in rows and learn from one instructor about what's needed to qualify to go from 5th grade to 6th grade, right? That model's got to be broken. That model's got to be about actually leveraging the technology and saying we can be anywhere we want to be. We can go to any locale. The space-time continuum has been shattered. And so for us to go back into fixed spaces and doing fixed things where kids' minds are actually able to embrace all kinds of different environments, why aren't we designing schools in ways like, I'm sure Dirk's going to talk about latitudes where kids don't even have a campus, right? They just, they meet online, they figure out what they're going to do, they go do it, and then they connect. And sometimes they meet in person, right? Doesn't this lend to, we live in Oakland, we live between Silicon Valley and San Francisco. Why aren't we leveraging our geography to teach kids math, to teach kids science? So I'm seeing more and more. The kid told me the other day, we meet at school every day, but on Fridays, we actually do our entire school day at Joaquin Miller Park. Mm-hmm. And I said, wow. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think you're going to see teachers start to say, wait a minute, this is not a dead end job. I can actually, there's latitude and mobility in being a teacher, because I can go from classroom teacher to an outdoor exploration teacher to a in-person science. I mean, there's so many different ways we can cut this thing up, but because again, we can see where this is headed. We can see that this is not serving our kids. So Dirk, man, I know you got something good for us.
Yeah, no, that's right on. I think, Latitude, the city is the campus. The region is the campus. Even this idea of like all the money we spend on buildings here, where again, those resources could be put to better use in a lot of ways. There was some beautiful reflections that young people who went to the Black Panther school, the Freedom School they're doing the Black Teacher Project is doing reflections with those kids. It's like 30 years later, 40 years later. And they did a survey of those kids and they're like, what do you remember? And the words they were like love, community, family, fun. And these folks are super powerful coming now at this age. And they're talked about how they didn't learn facts, they learned how to think, all these things that we want to talk about. And what would kids say now if you said, what do you think about school? Like, what's one word? I don't think very few would say love, family, community, fun. So I think there's a piece of the technology is missing, the use of technology in terms of really opening up school, but also it's really love is missing from our schools. Many of our kids just don't feel that from school. They don't feel that school actually is embracing them and wanting them to be the best that they could possibly be and seeing this vision of them as something even greater than maybe they see themselves. School just sees them as something to pass through and probably came in below with a lot of problems and probably won't do great. School's not helping them. And again, all these kids who went to Black Panther School had all the same challenges that our kids have right now, maybe even less supports in some ways. But that experience with less resources built them into something even stronger. The resources thing matter for sure, because it allows you to actually do this in a sustainable way versus when you're just running people to the ground because they're putting their own life into these projects, which just is not a sustainable way to run things over time on scale. But we really, school, as James said, it really is pretty much the same. It's shifted a little in terms of, I think, we do use more stations and kind of a little more group work than when I got involved with schools earlier on. I do think there have been some subtle changes in the way that school happens. But by and large, it's the same thing. And by and large, it's the same outcomes. And until we really do understand what engages kids, and again, a lot of times that's a teacher who just has their passion and shows that to you. And you pick up on that because you feel that from them. But we really, and it's for Black and brown. They're just two different school systems. That's one thing I'd say. Piedmont is very different than what you're getting at the Flatland schools in Oakland. It really is. It's just when we had a kid, I did an interview with a kid who transferred from Oakland to Piedmont, just to hear her talk about that difference and experience was just, it was deep. And it's like, yeah, all kids should have, why don't they all have that? It's really, as we said, it's not an issue if we don't have resources. We find $2 trillion in the couch cushion when we need to. And other fines, we can't find 2 nickels to rub together for Black kids. So it's really, there has to be a changing in the way we look at this. And I do think we're in a place where people are talking that equity talk in a different way. Things are moving. Those discussions are different than they have been historically. We work with a bunch of schools on Staten Island. And when that brother got killed selling Lucy's there, it wasn't really a big deal outside of the Black neighborhoods. George Floyd, now the staff are calling that the murder of George Floyd, and they're doing these monthly equity talks, and they're putting their Black, and that's Staten Island. They said they marched all the way across the island this time, where before, again, it was just in the Black neighborhoods. So this may be just a moment of kind of that passes as something else comes in and takes the public attention. But I hope it's not. And I think if we do a good job of really, I think you got to tie the history stuff to it. Again, 20% of white families can trace their history back to the Homestead Act, which gave them 120 acres. Any white immigrant who came here got 120 acres of native land, where we couldn't get 40 acres and a mule for recompense for free labor for 100 years. So really 20% of the white families here can trace their lineage back to the Homestead Act. Again, and that's even more, 120 acres free of charge.
So do we need educators more directly in the policy space? Because from what I'm hearing, I mean, Latitude High School, I'm amazed by, and we'll put their information in the show notes. I'm seeing internships, college coursework, entrepreneurship, a place-based education system. That reminds me of my experience as an educator at High Tech High down in San Diego, California. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, we want these schools to be a part of, so any student, whether you're in West Oakland or up in the hills or wherever you are, that you're receiving this comprehensive provision of education, because as you mentioned, Dirk, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes a whole lot. Yeah. And so I'm really mindful of, okay, how are we assessing the quality of education for students? Obviously, social emotional health has been of utmost concern recently. It's the engagement in the community. And we had the opportunity to talk with Juma Crawford, who is an Oakland resident now. He runs the Oakland Fund for Public Innovation. And Dirk, you're talking about, well, what curriculum is covered and what are we offering to students? He said, hell, give it all to them. Talk about 1619 and 1776, and then have them have a good argumentative debate and see what that kind of exposure, what kind of dialogue comes out of that. And then go into the community and do some really authentic work. And so do we have educators knocking on the door and having families going in and being part of the school environment? I mean, you design schools, Dirk, and James, you are so heavily involved in the political side of things. I mean, how does it manifest for those listening to this conversation right now?
Yeah, it really is. Like, again, the pandemic has opened. I think some families have really enjoyed homeschooling. Some kids have really thrived in this environment. Like, again, there's kids who really suffer with social anxiety, bullying at school. For many students, school is actually the most stressful place in their life in the way that it currently exists. And so I think thinking about how we continue to not do it the same way, something I've always thought about is like, really, there's a wonderful program here, Seeds, teaches parents and to basically become para-educators and then teachers, and really deep around the literacy, reading science and kind of really how you teach reading. I've often been like, why don't we just pay parents to kind of do stuff like that? Like, it's really your first teacher is your parent. How could we actually support parents in truly being partners with the school? Not like it's a job on top of your other two jobs, but we'll pay you to take courses around early literacy. We will actually pay you to be a partner in this in a different way than we do it right now. Or we expect you to kind of partner right now means like do what I tell you to do, and don't ask me to do more than I'm willing to do. That's what partnership typically means with schools. What if it was really different and we just compensated families for what it takes for them to really get up there to that point? So I do think there's just ways to re-envision that piece around what does partnership mean for parents? What does working in the community mean? And if we remember back to our own schooling experiences, you don't remember shit about doing a worksheet on something. It's something you did out in the community, most likely, or a teacher that had some really cool way of doing science, or, the things we remember about school are not traditional schooling. And I think most teachers actually don't want to have you sitting down doing worksheets. They want to be able to put themselves more into this work and make this work more interesting and relevant. And to Latitude, like I did a unit, they're doing a bunch of work around gentrification in Oakland right now. So again, we did a unit I went out with them. We went to Fruitvale Village, which is a community developed area. It was originally meant to be a parking lot for the BART, which again, who's served by a parking lot? Folks who are driving in to take the BART to go someplace else. Who's served by La Clinica? Community-owned businesses, food incubators, a school, a dental clinic, housing that's subsidized. Like, there's different ways we can build the city. We can build it for folks who want to come in and use it to get out, or we can build it for the neighborhoods here. And again, it's like the government's about redistribution of resources. That ultimately is what it does, redistributes opportunities and resources. And how's it gonna spend those resources? Is it gonna build Fruitvale Village, the community benefits from? Y'all have been here and been like done activities, you love this place. Or is it gonna build a parking lot that folks from outside the neighborhood will come and park in and go where they want to go? And again, this is where the kids live, many of them. So it's not just like some esoteric discussion. It's like, yeah, what if this was a parking lot?
Yeah. And so I'm just tripping, Dirk, because you got the Love Life, which the city council voted on maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And, it's like, it looks great. It looks great on the sign. It's a great message. But the irony is, are we willing to do the work to create a community and culture of loving life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the essential question, Jim, I think you're asking is, are we really willing to do the hard work, right, to recreate it? Because what we really have is, in some of our like medium cases, every student is about $15,000, right? But we look at that $15,000 in the same model. Well, we got to push that $15,000 into this system. And then through that course of action, then that $15,000 is going to equal this kid is actually better at something on the other side. And it's like, that's straight BS. Mm-hmm. What if you reimagine that $15,000? And so the courage that it takes to say, wait a minute, I mean, you're proposing we break up and like completely destroy the system? And I'm like, yeah, because it's not working, right? So look at the 15. And then when you look at the 15, like what Dirk is saying, then you start to realize that maybe there is an opportunity to pay a parent to actually do some engagement and some learning. And then maybe that parent gets smarter. Maybe that parent then is more productive. Yeah. And then maybe the student starts to develop and live in a culture of learning, right? And so but this idea that we wake up, we send them off to school, we're disconnected from it. The teacher in the school is in charge for 8 hours, and then they give them back to us. And we really encourage parent participation. It was like the pandemic has actually shown us we can do this totally different. Mm-hmm. Like, wow. Like, so the learning pod could be something. It's like, mm-hmm. Well, does this have to be something that divides us? Or is this something we say, well, we have 25 students that are severely behind. And so what if we restructured it in such a way there was a family component where they addressed some literacy in the morning, and then they went to school and we broke that learning pod into 2 teachers and we say, you know what, 13 of you in this class, 12 of you in the other, and here's what the focus is for today. And maybe you sequence that in such a way that you were able to buff up their reading skills. And then guess what? In 2 weeks, we're going to do a severe focus on math. Right. And you just do that dance and then you involve the family. But when you think about the $15,000 differently, that becomes an opportunity. But when you try to push that 15 into the system, it's just going to get eaten up. It's just the district is designed to swallow and destroy money. I mean, the district right now, I mean, I'm not saying that, but these are things you realize. It's like the district spends $3.5 million a day, whether you like it or not. Yeah. Just write checks. And so it's like, is that the best way to try to accelerate outcomes for kids who are severe? So you have one high school or 2 close to me where the proficiency rate is like 2%. Yeah. In math, in high school. And so wait a minute, man, this is not working. So yes, it's worth it, right? I mean, so that was like the magical part of the small schools movement. I believe it was unsustainable, but it made people say, man, this isn't working. Yeah. So I think that was the first indication. That was a first attempt at a strategic inflection point. I think it was a strategic inflection point. But now there's so much data and so much information saying, caution, change direction. Yeah. And so those communities that have the access and opportunity to have that inflection, to have that conversation and then form something new, we know that's going to happen. what we need to make sure it happens is for those people that don't have resource, how do we direct enough attention and resource and opportunity to those communities to have dynamic conversations about what it means to show up differently right now? And why I like right now as an opportunity, because you got districts like Oakland who still got $216 more million to spend over the next 3 years to solve this problem. So if Oakland's got 216, then rough math says LA's got probably $750 million.
Yeah.
So what are they doing? But the thing that gets in the way, politics. Well, no, we're going to fight about this because you don't know, we're going to fight about it. So that's the irony of it, is the money's right there, but we're so married to the way we do business, it's hard to pull ourselves away from it.
Yeah. I love that. The district does just eat money and spit out a nickel. Like, it's kind of interesting, like, and that's hard. And I would say overall, like, working in New York, the funding is 100% different and like 100% better. Our base funding is higher than that per kid. You get 23,000 extra for kids that have special ed that get services up to 60% of the day. We have a charter that serves really high needs kids and gets $114,000 a year. By contract. You can basically bill special ed for whatever the costs are, as long as you can prove that it's within the IEP's range. So it really is just different. Like the schools I sit on there, 40% of the kids would be kids that would be in self-contained classes, and they're in regular general ed classrooms, and every classroom 16 to 1-to-1. And the funding just supports that. In a way, for California, we don't pay for high needs kids. Like, that having more high needs kids just basically there's a little bit more money, but it doesn't nearly capture what the costs of really serving many students are. There's many students who have like a one-on-one para that's not even within their IEP. It's just the school knows they need to do that, and so they kind of do it. But that sucks out of general fund, and so the funding here is just totally inadequate. It is inadequate in the base funding, but the supplemental funding here is just ridiculous. That's really the biggest problem to me, is we don't fund kids with higher needs in the way that they actually to cost. And that creates a lot of weird incentives around the way, in terms of how those kids get treated sometimes, including by charters and the district, I think.
Right.
Like, so hey, if we really cared, we'd change the funding formula fundamentally. Like the LCSF, they give you a little bit more money but it really doesn't. It's not a hill of beans compared to what the real cost for high needs would be if we really supported those kids in the way that we should. But
Can I just add
the way to change who gets it? I think there's a piece. The hubs have been super successful.
Yeah.
In some instances, like why isn't there a way where parents just get money I want to send my kid to the hub, and the hub costs money. I want my kid to get a dyslexia screening, and that costs money. I want my kid to get supplemental summer services, and that costs money. There should be a process where families can kind of figure out where some of that money that's supposed to serve their kids actually goes. And they may just say, hey, I want all that just to go in the system. I think the system's rocking it. But if they don't, there should be a place where they can figure that out. Sorry, James, I cut you.
No, man, because you keep making these good points. I'm going to say, so what Dirk is suggesting is right. And they tried it with the millionaires tax in 2014, which flooded all this extra money into the district, and hundreds of millions of dollars. And then what Dirk said about the supplemental and concentration money, that money went up, right? And then we were able to make these amazing investments in school programs, like at schools that needed, like Elmhurst, Castlemont, McLean, all this supplemental dollars. And so what I watched happen so when it reached its max, then all that supplemental just had to cut it. All the programs that were built in through supplemental concentration dollars, cut. And so now you can barely trace the supplemental and concentration money that came from the local control funding formula, which is now expired. It reached its max. And so all of those gains were basically erased, due to the needs of that big, bulky system, benefits, all those things. 65% of that money in Oakland went to teacher salary increases. 35% went to other stuff, part of that 35% was the supplemental and concentration stuff that our students with high needs need most. All that stuff got cut.
Foster care managers got cut. Like foster care, I think there's one foster care manager for the whole district right now.
Cut.
The Office of Equity, there used to be an African-American female achievement director. There no longer is. Like these programs that actually really matter for our most vulnerable students are the ones that kind of go first on the chopping block, which again, it's just.
Well, Dirk, even naming it, I mean, we call it supplemental. That shouldn't be supplemental. Yeah. It's necessary. You talk about the logistics of instruction in a classroom, and we go to scope and sequence right away in the curriculum and lesson planning. How about that other shit? Like, sorry, I'm going to curse, but how about that other stuff about getting to know your student that's in front of you? What's their story? Where are they from? They have assets. Dirk, you started with deficit-minded thinking when you were getting into education. I mean, we need to realize that the classrooms that we are in, it's not defined as the teachers, it is the students. And so when you're conscious of that, and James, you go back to exactly why is it that this continues to happen? Well, it's apparently it's laziness, because we love compartmentalizing and getting one sheet of paper that has the data in front of us that says, okay, this is the percentage increase of this. These are the dollars spent here, and it strips away the humanity and the relational aspect of this work. And going back to your point, Dirk, is like, we need to paint that coherence of the classroom, and then the home, and then the parent and the student and the ecosystem there, because learning doesn't just happen within the four walls of a classroom. It truly is about building coalition. And it's so easy to just say, these are the things and how it's been. Newness is scary for many people, especially politicians, because that is a very cushy job. I've never been in it, but I'm assuming that it's much more difficult than teaching. And so they probably ask, can you track that? When do those that are receiving the benefits of these dollars, when do we get off the hook for not having to report on that anymore? Because if you can establish some coherence about we're in education because we want lifelong health and wellness for our kids, among many other things, but we want them to have an enjoyable life. How do we make that happen? It's hard to put together key performance indicators for that sometimes. So I'm mindful of the time. God, I wish time was less linear. We could keep going on this, but I would regret it if I didn't at least highlight some of the reasons why we're in this space together today. We talk about bringing attention to educational disparities, an urgent need to increase access, and you're both doing that in Oakland through Families in Action, which again we will highlight in the show notes. It's about building coalitions and the citywide movement for quality schools. I'll offer the floor to you both, not so much a question, but just an offering of anything else that you'd like to share for the listeners, for the viewers at home, to inspire, to engage, to recommit, or to knock against the door.
I'll start with kind of what you said, which is the system is not broken. It functions exactly as it's supposed to, but it's a system that's built by men and women and everyone. And it either, on some level, you're either supporting that system, you're a collaborator with that system, you're silent in watching it snuff the lives out of Black and brown and many white kids and many underserved kids of all different types. Or you need to do something to fight to change this system, or find a new system, or just get out of the system. And help others run away, jump off the slave ship too. So, and we can do that. I just think all these things can change, but it takes us, the community, pushing for those changes and really listening to the folks that we're supposed to be serving and representing about what they need, and how they're experiencing the system. And if we do that, I think we're going to be right on in terms of where we go and how we move, and we'll always be moving in the right direction. And it's always been a struggle. It's not about the end game in some sense. It's about moving forward and fighting against something that we know is wrong. And that's that is where we are. And I think we can win. And every little small win is a win.
Yep, I agree completely. And, it's not enough today to say Black Lives Matter, right? our action has to be, because Black Lives Matter, this is what I'm doing to actually make. And so you can put Brown Lives Matter, because American lives matter. Here's what I'm doing. I recognize that what we did yesterday is not working to the benefit of everyone. And it's my responsibility to step forward and contribute to a change in that area and join the conversation. And it's messy and it's all of those things. But, you know, we live in a capitalist driven country. So the temptation, like you said, Jim, is to be the lazy capitalist who just looks at the sheet and says, yes, it went up. We did our job. But because we're such a complex and diverse society, we can't have an indicator with just one indicator, right? There's a series of indicators that we're as a community responsible for. And we take, by virtue of growing and being who we are, we've taken that on. And so we have to make it make sense. We can't default to being lazy capitalists. And I just feel like it's coming, man. I feel like the way I'm seeing people show up is an indication. Maybe I don't see it in my lifetime, but it seems to me that people in this country have come together in a way that I've not seen them come together. And a lot of it is lasting. And I think people want to take that next step. And it's like, let's increase community productivity. Let's do things that get people active. Let's do things that get people to engage in community and want to be in the places that we want to help. Yeah. And I think that's going to happen, whether we like it or not. I know we three will like it, but I think that's going to happen, man. So I'm excited about the time. The last thing I'd say, I read a great book where a dude talks about America as an innovation, right? And it has no geographic roots. It's not like Russia, right? It's an idea that we all share. Ideas as innovations are like the iPhone. I made this iPhone part up about, it's like the iPhone's not the same one from 2007, right? It's been upgraded as a result of consumer use. If we think about America in that same way, we've seen upgrades in the treatment of women. We've seen upgrades in the treatment of Black people. We've seen upgrades in the treatment of poor people, and the list goes on. And so the pandemic could perhaps have been like, oh, we could suffer that. So then how do we upgrade ourselves to actually inoculate against pandemic, to inoculate against the disconnectivity that comes with the pandemic? So, I think it's easy to look at it as we're oppressed, but it's like we're growing. We're getting better for the next generation. And I just think we're ready to take that step, man. So I think this has been an exciting year and opportunities right there, man. We just got to dive in.
Yeah, I agree. And the kids are great. Like, the kids are better than we are. Right. When I talk to young people across the spectrum, I just feel like young people are much more thoughtful than I was, much more open than I was at that age. And I do feel like they're pushing harder than young people did before, in a way. I just feel like I have a lot of hope in the young people. And like you said, it may not be in our generation, James. I'm only like 18. I don't know how old James is. But I do think this trend is coming.
Dirk, you mentioned, going through the system and coming out on the other side. I think about Barack Obama when he first started. He had that nice set of dark black hair, and then when he left, he had that gray hair. Yeah, now James still looks good.
I know.
Secret that
I know.
I bought the hair dye company. I bought the hair dye company, man.
Hey, that message of hope from both of you in terms of students, they know they're all right. They got amazing resilience. And then James, that message of hope about, hey, we're still making progress. We're still ticking up is amazing. And it's a great thought to leave our audience with. Again, for those listening at home, we've had Dirk Tillotson with us, the executive director, founder of Great School Choices, James Harris, an amazing educational reformer, currently with 510 Media, former president of the OUSD Board of Education. Thank you both for this conversation. I hope you have a great, great day.
Thank you for having us.
Cool. Thank you, brother. Great seeing you, James.
Good to see you, Dirk.
More to come.